you should check out Tidebreaker. Odds are good that if you've spoken to me for any length of time about media analysis, especially in the days of the internet, you've probably heard me say something pretty mean-spirited about TV tropes. Now, this isn't just because TV Tropes is a website with some pretty mid kind of opinions and an oddly checkered history, and they won't delete my old Troper page because I don't have access to the email address it was built around anymore, so I have this strange preserved jewel from like 10 years ago now. Anyway, TV Tropes is an amazing resource for the discussion of the components of stories. For a lot of people, I think it's probably their first introduction to just the idea of tropes. The first time you get to see the gears and nuts and bolts that make up storytelling. And for some people, it's really important that this is the transcendental step away from a story did a thing to this is why an author chooses to do a thing. Normally, when I talk about TV tropes, it's gonna come across as being just inherently critical, because I criticize it a lot. And part of that ties to the ways that TV tropes teaches a particular model of criticism that looks at lists of things. It wants to categorize and organize, so works can be measured based on which of the bad tropes it has, versus which of the good tropes it has. And if enough people have voted that this deserves to be a justified trope, or if something has been shuffled off to the Your Mileage May Vary tab. It's not a bad project, though, and for all that I criticize it, the term, like TV tropes, can be used value neutrally, and indeed, almost as a kind of praise if you're doing it in the right time at the right place. So I want to talk to you about Tidebreaker, a TV tropesy cinematic RPG. Tidebreaker is a single-book RPG made by Nick Butler, an author from Connecticut, about whom I know very little, and I'll put a little asterisk here about what I know as I move on to the next point, which is to say, Tidebreaker as a work deserves a special attention for not centralizing a white identity. You might not know what that means if you're in my audience, and let's face it, a lot of the people who are going to be looking for people who look like me talking about games are going to be a white audience. Whiteness, as you are used to experiencing it, is not an actual thing that exists. It's a socially signified event. There is a structure around you that is looking for a barcode that reads white, and that whiteness then gets used on things it can be imposed on. I say this as whiteness is a fog. Characters who have no reason to be identified as white in media that never depicts them will nonetheless get assumed to be white because the whiteness that you live around is the whiteness that is trying to make everything recognize itself. This is the kind of thing that means that when a single character in a work isn't white, that's diverse, and when two characters are, that gets seen as like, well, aren't they pushing it a little? Whiteness is the permeating material around which most of your experiences have to shape. And this is why you get fascists loving anime, because they see those characters and can think, that's a white guy, even though, very obviously, they are not. They can see the whiteness and therefore borrow the humanity of those characters, even though, in a more realistic engagement, they would have nothing to do with one another. I bring this up because when I talk about centralizing white identity, I mean that there is a default way of being, especially in the tabletop RPG space, even in down to the text and language we use about which continents are framed as being full of savages and which ones are filmed with civilization, that does fundamentally still try to build off this idea of whiteness. And I'm not bringing this up to say that I am an expert in how Tidebreaker is not white. I'm talking about just the simple flip through and the art of this game and the kinds of words it uses in its game language, and indeed why I refer to it as TV tropesy. I didn't find any major characters in the first 2/3 of this book in the pop art that's meant to make you look at the game and think, oh, this is what stories are like, this is where the characters belong, that very obviously looked to me like a white guy. That's not to say that there isn't stuff in there that I'm sure someone with a different mindset than mine would go, oh yeah, that's a white guy. There might well be some in there. I didn't pass it that way anywhere. But the thing with this is you still see all sorts of cool characters doing amazingly neat stuff. And all of that expression is just being done without the same standardized default that you might already be used to in the TTRPG space. This also shows up in the game language, the kinds of terminology this game uses to describe the execution of things, and the tools and toolkit for building your characters and the world and the scenarios. But let's talk about the resolution mechanic first. The tiebreaker resolution mechanic is a dice pool system. That is, for any given task, you're going to roll a number of dice and look on those dice to see which ones come up with a target number or better. This simple system is going to use just D6s. You're not dealing with specialized D10s, and the math in question doesn't involve looking for like 7, 8s, 9s, and 0s. It's looking for the upper half on the dice. The system has added complications to these kinds of dice where, for example, bad numbers take away successes, and for particular kinds of tasks, or tasks you're good at, or tasks where a special ability is being played, you get ignites, where your 6s get to be rolled again, and you can maybe have even bigger pulls. This is a type of game mechanic I've heard described as bursting or exploding D6s, and it's a pretty cool one. It allows for these big, exciting, explosive moments where someone might roll 3 6s in a row, and suddenly a thing that looked impossible is happening very easily. Or you might immensely overkill something, and everyone remembers how funny it was that that's when your character decided to go Nova on something. There is a small complaint I have here about the resolution mechanic, where one of the mechanics that the game uses refers to a resource called Hope. Hope is first introduced on page 20. It is not explained, there is no sidebar, and it shows up in full explanation later, 25 pages on. That's irritating. I would normally tease any system for making that kind of mistake, so here is the official poke on Tidebreaker. Tidebreaker is notable for having a out-of-the-box, completely collaborative building for setting. You don't come to Tidebreaker with a world in mind that you want to get people to engage with. Part of starting a Tidebreaker game is discussing with your players the kinds of things you want to include in the world, in the story, and for the kinds of things you want the story to be about. A good idea for the kind of game Tidebreaker is that its default tools for building a setting offer you noir, shonen, and supers out of the box. So if you're thinking of something that can be considered one of those general styles, Tidebreaker will help you make one. And importantly, Tidebreaker doesn't need you to come to the table with one already. I love this idea that building the world you're going to introduce the players to is part of that collaborative starting experience. This means that instead of character creation, where players normally get invested, which is why I am normally so involved in the idea that players should be getting the character creation section right at the start of the book, the building of the world is the thing that players get involved in. People get to introduce their ideas, the things they like. And, as Tidebreaker is wont to suggest you do, it's full of suggestions to do, well, stealing. Steal things. Find things from other media work that you like, bring that up, add that to the table. Say, I want to do something in a world like Chainsaw Man, or I want to do something in something like Avatar The Last Airbender, or I want to have The Boondocks as a neo-noir mystery. These are ideas that this game system is able to grab a hold of and get sunk into, because the tools are about populating these big high-concept ideas. And this is where we get that same centering of the non-white, because you get these tables that are full of characters to roll up and locations to generate and ideas to incarnate in your world. And just the language used to describe them has all these little hints of, oh yeah, this is stuff that doesn't come from a white person's perspective. These are not the problems that would be in the top 20 list of most white people. It includes things like anti-immigrant sentiment, gentrification, slumlords, surveillance, war rationing and shortages, refugee crises, unjust laws, labor conditions, prejudice, unemployment, poverty, and the corrupt police. Now, don't get me wrong, there are absolutely white people who care a lot about those things. Usually because they're trans. Character building is very much more think up a guy, find the word that describes them, and then see if the mechanics expressed there get you where you want to be. I like that this, for example, doesn't have any kind of game mechanical use for the term quirky, but it does have the use for murder hobo. If you're the kind of person who likes to talk about characters and likes to invoke this terminology, again, TV trope style, to communicate these big ideas of style and tone to people, that you'll be able to build a character probably very well suited to your needs. The mechanics will serve as scaffolding underneath you, and then you'll be able to take their story in other directions immediately after that. In a lot of ways, Tidebreaker isn't here to offer you what a lot of TTRPG books think they should. It's not going to give you a setting, it's going to give you tools for building your own setting. Really, what Tidebreaker gives is a mood, a tone, and resolution mechanics. The structure of storytelling very much borrows from television in terms of episodic structure, the importance of characters in episode-to-episode experiences. Not every character needs to be as important in each episode. There can be spotlights and moments where characters are put forward. That's a specific mechanic in the game. And it even simplifies most of its resolution mechanics down to combat, reputation, and subterfuge, which is to say, what you do, who knows it, and who doesn't know it. Look, I think Tidebreaker is really cool. It's not a game I personally need in my collection for most of my play experiences. I'm the kind of person who wants a lore book that I can present to my players so they can ooh and ah and think about places they want to integrate into the world that I'm presenting to them, as could be expected from the kinds of books I like. But that doesn't change the fact that this book is amazing. It's excellent at everything it's trying to do. The fact that I can nitpick about just like 2 points in the structure and formatting is kind of impressive, and the whole thing is told with this joyous indulgence in wanting to make the kinds of stories it cares about feel as good to execute as they are to experience. I think Tidebreaker is great. I definitely think you should check it out. And now I'm going to go back to that asterisk that I mentioned right at the start. Because one of the things I do know about Nick Butler is, according to the description on Nick Butler's Twitter and website, is Black AF. And I didn't want to bring that up as if it legitimized the position that this book doesn't centralize white people, because at that point it feels like I'm committing a sort of genetic lineage, or, yes, I, the white person, am here to bring you the lineage of this strange thing from far-off lands. No, the book does it itself. The book on its own stands up and says, hey, this is a storytelling game about these kinds of stories. Here's what I care about. Here's who's included. And there's nothing saying white people have to get out. I don't have to delete my copy. Nick Butler got my money and is probably quite happy to keep it. But this is still a work that is expressing an ideology and a heart that doesn't have to think of me as the default. You should check out Tidebreaker.